Where the Scary Things Are is the latest film from writer-director B. Harrison Smith, who's the guy responsible for making films like Camp Dread, Zombie Killers, Death House, and The Special. Now, I've talked about some of his stuff before, and he's one of those people who, like a lot of creatives these days, he's got his own podcast, which lets you feel like you're a little bit more personally connected to the dude. Harrison Smith is very much one of those people where I really like his outlook on films and movie making in general, often more than I actually like his films themselves. I always want to say that he's one of these great unsung heroes of the genre, this little kind of under the radar, totally independently minded guy doing his own thing. Now, that is true to an extent, and that's totally what makes him so interesting as a filmmaker, his whole ethos. The biggest problem, though, is that even his best films are, to be brutally honest, above average at best. I still think that the best of his films is his first movie, which was 2014's Camp Dread, which was this sort of decent, honest slasher with some nice commentary and a couple of brilliant performances from industry vets Eric Roberts and Felissa Rose, as well as a surprisingly likeable cast of ripe young'uns. But there's always been that feeling that what should have happened was that Camp Dread was the beginning of a solid career for Harrison Smith, but he sort of fumbled the ball and then went on to sort of never really capture that high again. Although I will say that I think that his fourth film, The Special, the one that came out prior to Where the Scary Things Are, was a huge step up. Although, that said, it was the only one of Harrison Smith's films where B. Harrison himself didn't actually write the script, which maybe might actually tell you something. But I really like B. Harrison Smith, and I feel that however you feel about his films, he's a guy whose heart is totally in the right place, and who is passionate in his denouncement of cynicism in filmmaking, which is a totally admirable stance to take. So, it makes sense then that Where the Scary Things Are, B. Harrison Smith's fifth horror film in a career that kicked off just short of 10 years ago, was something that I'd be looking forward to a fair bit, especially considering how lackluster I think 2022 has been for horror so far. The plot of this one involves a group of media-savvy young kids who call themselves the Dockers, although perhaps they should have called themselves the Doxers, who have all got names like Snack and Mighty and Bran, who are always just one step away from being suspended for doing bad things. They get set this project to basically create their own urban legend. When they're out looking for ideas, they stumble across this kind of hideous Swamp Thing type monster, who they manage to capture and keep prisoner, and who soon becomes the Dockers' latest obsession. But rather than this kind of cutesy monster film, our kids are more interested in actually torturing the creature and streaming the whole thing online. And the question becomes, as is often the way with these things, how far will the kids go to get clicks? So I think the first thing to say about this film is that Harrison Smith himself describes the high concept pitch for this one, the kind of hook, as being about looking at a kind of Goonies type gang of kids, but imagining how that group dynamic and how those characters would be different if they existed in a world of modern technology, social media, YouTube, the internet, and the ways in which that changes how they interact with each other and the world. Of course, the end result is something pretty grim and rather frightening about what it's got to say about our future as a species. Harrison Smith equated this to being like, what if the kids that found E.T. or found Sloth from the Goonies weren't these lovable misfit goofballs, but what if they were more like the Columbine kids, these disaffected sociopathic outsiders who can only communicate with negative emotions? Now that's a cool idea, but there's two fundamental problems with that, which I think work against it being as good as it could have been. Number one is that there's always the feeling like we're kind of meant to quite like this gang, that they've somehow got this kind of misfitty outsider type charm. The gang consists of, I think it's 4 or maybe 5 sort of later teen boys, a younger preteen boy, and a single female, and of the gang it's only the girl, who's called Ayla, who really gets a chance to shine as a total fucking nutjob. Whilst a lot of the other kids are kind of made out to be more pathetic or sort of inward and detached characters. So instead of getting a gang of utter misanthropes who you could actually believe would be this fucked up, There's kind of a detachment where there's more of an emphasis on the fact that rather than being totally evil, these kids are just sort of a bit bored or a bit awkward. Now that's fine if you're trying to say that they're no longer capable of feeling emotions because they've been totally desensitized to reality by the technology that rules their lives, but it ends up making the whole film feel lifeless and sort of stodgy. You sort of feel like they're less a group of psychos than that it's just one evil girl and a group of sort of goth nerd hangers-on who drift about lazily after her. There needed to be a clearer sense of who these characters are, so that you appreciate more what it is that they're actually doing. Which ties into the second problem, which is that there's a feeling that this is a film that for a good maybe 85% of its runtime is very much pulling its punches. A lot of the gore is very restrained, it's shown off screen or it's in very quick flashes, and a lot of it is done just with suggestion. The fact that this is also a film about a group of kids who crack lame jokes and have their own shticks, and that it's got a sort of average kind of TV movie feel to a lot of its pacing and plotting, makes this kind of feel like it's a film that's pitching for a younger audience. Now oddly, I think that's one of the biggest issues that I've got with Where the Scary Things Are, because it undersells just how dark the central idea really is. If you pull back and make this more palatable as a film for teenagers, you lose its ability to be more than just another one of those 80s films that this is trying to comment on. When it does go full horror movie, which is mainly towards the end, it doesn't shy away from crossing the line into really dark territory. So it just makes me wish that there wasn't such a wishy-washy attitude towards the lead characters, and that feeling that it's sort of meant to be a bit fun, and we're sort of vaguely meant to enjoy hanging out with this wacky gang. It really needed to make these kids absolute fucking monsters, and then it could have really made its points. As it is, it feels like what began as a really good idea has lost a lot of its bite and its edginess, and instead it materialises as this kind of very claustrophobic, slightly muddy looking film that lacks a strong sense of identity in itself, and ends up feeling dull and rather annoying. Because characters that should be terrifying grotesques are made to feel more like irritating cliches, because that lack of conviction means that you're never sure until you get to the end if you're actually meant to like certain characters or not. There's a real saggy sense of narrative logic as well, where you're never entirely sure who's where, or how long passes between scenes, or how certain things even happen. The monster, who gets named a little bit underwhelmingly Crock-a-Mole, sort of gets forgotten about for long stretches of time, when you can't help but think, sorry, these kids just found a monster and now they're walking away and leaving it. But overall, I mean, it's not in a traditional sense a monster movie. There's this whole thing about one of the characters saying when they see this drippy, oozy swamp monster that the kids keep chained up, is that a guy in a suit? Now that can be a dangerous game to play, especially in a case like this, where yeah, obviously it is just a guy in a suit, but because the creature's colour scheme is black, black and blacker, you don't really get anything other than just the sense, the sort of shape of a muck monster, and it's really just a generic beastie, because the real monster, or monsters in this film, the real scary things, are of course the kids themselves, and Lila in particular as the ringleader. That's fine, that's a solid enough idea, it's just a shame that the monster itself is just the bare minimum that it needs to be. Ideally you want something like Bub in Day of the Dead if you're going to aim high, where you can actually feel sympathetic towards the creature itself, which is being tortured and horribly abused. The only thing I think is arresting about it is an idea that it can smell your fear, it can sense fear, which I seem to recall being the exact same gimmick as Marvel's own resident muck monster, the Man-Thing. Ultimately though, I think Where the Scary Things Are never fully delivers on what it could have been, and it leaves you with a pretty basic splodge of an ending that once again doesn't pay off any of the film's ideas, isn't really unique or interesting or even a logical endpoint to what the film's been building up to. I think Harrison Smith's previous film, The Special, for all its dick-in-a-box unsavoury weirdness, totally delivered on an ending that made total sense thematically for what that film was all about. The same could be said again for Camp Dread. This just doesn't have that special spark to it. And whilst I can look past the fact that it does feel pretty cheap, and a lot of the cast ultimately aren't really that great value for money, in that their performances are never more than adequate, I can't look past the fact that it's just not a film that feels like it's got the courage of its convictions in having a strong, single idea, taking that idea to the logical conclusion, and telling a story that's actually worth telling. I'm going to have to come right in the middle for this one at a 5 out of 10. No matter how much I want to like it or how much I appreciate where it's coming from, I just can't rate this one as being any more than an okay but flawed attempt at turning that way too overplayed Goonies type idea on its head. I can't really recommend this outright, so I guess what I'll say instead is go and check out Camp Dread or go and watch The Special, because those are both much better films. And you know what? Ultimately, say what you want about this film, I was fairly disappointed in it, I've got to admit, but I am still really looking forward to what Harrison Smith makes next, and I'll probably always go in with a whole lot of goodwill, no matter what, because I know that he's coming from a good place, and to me, that's really worth a lot. I just wish that I could have liked this more than I did, but I just didn't.